let's talk Hamlet. Acts 2 and 3. Now, these two acts are very closely related, and that's why I feel it is proper to group them together in talking about them. Not because of any deficit, per se, out of things to talk about in Act 2. It's certainly not about Act 3. But because it makes a lot of sense to really look at them closely as a unified whole. In them, we see a lot of payoff for what we have set up in Act 1. There's a ghost who has convinced Hamlet that there is a likelihood that his father was murdered. Not just murdered, but murdered by his own brother, who is now king, who has hastily married his wife, Gertrude. And Hamlet descends into a sense of madness, and everybody can tell that he is disturbed by something, but they can't quite pinpoint what the problem is. Polonius, who is a close confidant to the king, the current king, Claudius, believes that it is his daughter, Ophelia, and her affections that has been the entire cause of this madness. And we see pretty early on that he is confessing as much to the king and queen, that Polonius is expressing that this is my theory, that, you know, in Act 1, Polonius told Ophelia to keep distant from Hamlet and to not return his affections. And so some time has passed, and we've learned that she has been doing this. And that is the suspicion of what has caused all this. The king is not necessarily convinced in this, but is willing to go and have it be tested. And so Hamlet and Polonius have an exchange of words, a verbal sparring, so to speak. And it becomes clear as ever that Polonius is not the sharpest tool in the toolbox within here. He is easily confused. He is good for a smile and a laugh with some of his jumbled madness. And this leads to some very famous lines. The well-known words by Hamlet. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune happen within this section. You know, there's lots and lots of really quotable stuff and really, really recognizable stuff. Even if you've never read Hamlet, odds are, as you're reading along through this, you're kind of nodding it and saying, okay, yeah, I know this. I've heard this line, I've heard this phrase. And at the end of Act 2, Hamlet is met with some players that have come into town to put on performance. And he's delighted at the prospect, and he interrogates them a bit on their knowledge of certain plays and scenes, and then asks them if he could ad-lib a dozen, 20 lines or so to put into a certain performance that they happen to know. They oblige. And so all of this is setting up Act 3. But the other real big thing to note is that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are two of Hamlet's close friends, kind of like childhood chums. And they are employed by the king and queen to keep an eye on Hamlet, to kind of assess him, and to report back. And so that leads to some really interesting exchanges in Act 3 with Hamlet and his two friends, where he has I think it's a recorder from one of the players, and asks them to play something on it. And they say, oh, we don't have the skill. And he says, well, all you do is you put it to your lips, you blow, you cover the holes, and, oh, we can't do this. And he remarks that, but you can play me, and yet you say you don't have the skill to play something like this, but you have no problems playing me, your friend. Really, really profound. And it shows a level of perception in Hamlet that is just remarkable. And the big payoff here comes in Act 3, where the performance takes place. And Hamlet is watching, and he's employed the Horatio, who was one of the guards who had brought him to see the king ghost in Act 1. And the vital point in here to note is that Hamlet is showing sense in not blindly trusting the ghost that we saw from Act 1. The ghost mentioned who murdered him and how it was done. And so he sets up this performance to be kind of an imitation, so to speak, of the circumstances. A king getting murdered by poison being poured in his ear, and that second brother hastily marrying the wife, and at the climactic scene here where the poison is being poured, Hamlet's watching, Horatio's watching, and the king jumps to his feet and shouts for lights. And that is the confession that Hamlet needs. That there is some sense of guilt here. Because otherwise, why else would there be a reaction? It hits too close to home. To Claudius, the king. And so Hamlet knows he's going to go through now. The king is at fault and must avenge my father. Okay? Prior to this, the king had already decided to send Hamlet off to England to fulfill their end of a bargain, which was a pretty common occurrence back in this time where, different people would go in and serve for a time as not necessarily a hostage, but essentially kind of like a hostage exchange. I'll send my son over to you, and you send me your daughter, and it'll keep both of us in our best behavior because we want the best for our children. Sorry about that. And so the fallout here from this performance, Hamlet is being called to go and visit his mother. And on his way to do that, he comes across the king. Not only does he come across the king, but the king is not aware of him. He's alone. His back is turned. He's kneeling in prayer. And so that's the part that I want to jump into here, because I find this to be a really powerful scene. And Hamlet's response, his reaction to it, if I could find it. I should have put my bookmark there, but I didn't. Because why would I think that far ahead? But he comes across. Gosh, I could have sworn it was before that part. Yeah, it's going to be before this. Okay, so the king is kneeling. He's praying. This is in Act 3, Scene 3. And Hamlet comes across this. And Hamlet is going to hesitate. He knows what he should do. He has everything he needs to know to strike out and take the king, take his life. Now might I do it, Pat. Now is a praying, and now I'll do it. And so it goes to heaven, and so am I revenged. That would be scanned. A villain kills my father, and for that I, his sole son. do this same villain send to heaven? Why, this is hire and salary, not revenge. Took my father grossly, full of bread, with all his crimes broad blown as flush as May, and how his audit stands, who knows, save heaven. But in our circumstance and course of thought, 'tis heavy with him, and I am then revenged to take him in the purging of his soul, when he is fit and seasoned for his passage. No. Up sword, and know thou a more horrid hent, when he is drunk asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed, at game a swearing, or about some act that has no relish of salvation in it. Then trip him, that his heels may kick at heaven, and that his soul may be as damned and black as hell, whereto it goes. My mother stays this psychic, but prolongs thy sickly days. So he knows he is of a sound enough mind to not be blinded by absolute rage and wanting and craving this justice, that he is aware the king is in the middle of praying. He's likely repenting, confessing of the sin he is guilty of, being pressed to it by this performance from the play. And that if he were to strike him now, what mercy it would show to the king, because his crimes have been laid bare. He would likely go to heaven as a result, because he's done his confession. He's lifted that weight from his soul. And who knows where his father dwells, because his father didn't have that opportunity. So his father might be condemned into hell or purgatory. And so instead of striking now, Hamlet vows to wait until he can catch him in some act, some vile deed, whether drunkenness, sleeping with the queen, considering it incestuous, an affair that they are having, some other reason where it'll be assured that he will go to the proper place as punishment for what he did to Hamlet's father. The topic of madness is one that is heavy upon the actions and reactions that we see in Hamlet. And the more I read this, the less convinced I am that it is madness at all within Hamlet, at least up to this point. He is showing deliberate consideration, thought, planning, the ability to withhold even when things have been absolutely laid clear. He pleads with his mother following that encounter, the potential encounter with the king. He pleads for her to, if nothing else, just stay chaste for a while. Don't imbibe any more in the sin that you are in the midst of with this new king, this brother, at least until things sort themselves out. That it couldn't have been love. You are too old for it to be the throes of passion that have led you so quickly into his bed. And yes, in the one of my favorite, most quotable scenes or lines in the play, the queen cries out, is a little startled by Hamlet's firmness, his intense interrogation. So she cries out, and Polonius, who is hiding within the room, cries out in response. Hamlet, not knowing who is there, goes and stabs with his sword, and Polonius utters, "Oh, I am slain." And now, granted, Hamlet doesn't take ownership of that death. He lays it at his mother's feet. But the idea of madness, of And even looking back, would any of this played out had it not been for the ghost? Would Hamlet have ended up just being sent off to England and been content to live out his days far away from throne, from the hasty marriage, from all the sights and sounds and things that would remind him of his father and of the bothersome nature of what took place after his father's death? I don't know. But it's interesting to think about. So I look forward to talking Acts 4 and Acts 5. I don't know whether it'll be across 1 or 2 videos. But I hope you're enjoying Hamlet as much as I do.